I'm your host, Daniel James II, and we're back at it again with Season 3 of the Culture Connect, the podcast for the South Carolina Commission for Minority Affairs. Inspired by the vision of our Executive Director, Dr. Dolores DaCosta, we bring forward the voices of the forgotten, the stories of the unheard, and the realities of the marginalized in the Palmetto State. This season, you're going to hear from community organizers, business owners, nonprofit experts, tribal leaders, filmmakers, men and women, striving every day to make South Carolina a great place to live for all of its citizens. Be sure to follow us on all digital platforms so you don't miss the next episode of the Culture Connect. Hello, family. Welcome to this episode of the Culture Connect. We have a very, very special guest in the studio today. We have a USC administrator, professor, civil rights historian as well, just an icon here in South Carolina. We have Dr. Bobby Donaldson. Welcome to the show, Dr. Donaldson.
Thank you. Glad to be with you.
Of course, Dr. Donaldson. Now, I would like to know, what does the name Flipper mean to you? And tell us the story behind that, because I know that's a nickname that you had from very young.
Well, Flipper was my nickname given to me by my great-grandfather, whose given name was Smart Williams. And Smart Williams was born in 1897 or 1898 in Aiken County, South Carolina. He was my maternal grandmother's father. I spent a lot of time with him, and I was the first great-grandchild of our generation, and he gave me the name Flipper. Why that is the case, I don't know, but that was the name given to me. That was the name I responded to. Mm-hmm. And ironically, my nickname for him was Mo Daddy. And at a little age, I could not distinguish between daddy, granddaddy, and great-granddaddy. Mm-hmm. So my little self said, he's the more daddy. So Mo Daddy became the name I gave him. Flipper was the name he gave me. He had a tremendous impact on my rearing and my thoughts about history and reading. My great-grandfather was one of the smartest people I knew. However, my great-grandfather only had a second grade formal education. And probably when I was about 5 or 6, 7 years old, I remember him reading the newspaper. I remember him reading the Bible. There was one particular occasion where he was asked to sign a document, and Granddaddy, Mo Daddy, put an X in the spot for a signature. And I was just like, that's not your name. Your name is Smart Williams. And I said, Granddaddy, why did you put the X? Mm-hmm. And he began to explain to me that although he could read, he could not write.
Wow.
And he told me that the X was his mark. And then later that came up again, and he said, Flipper, whatever you do, you leave your mark. That's my mark, but you leave yours. So I tell that story often about how a man with a second grade education helped to shape a young man who later pursued a PhD.
Oh, wow. That's a powerful story and legacy. And when I read about that concerning your life, I never met my great-grandfather, but my grandfather had the same sort of testimony in terms of making and molding me. He had a 6th grade education, but my most vivid memories of him, he was very intelligent, not necessarily an intellectual, mm-hmm. but he was very intelligent. My most vivid memories are him reading newspaper, him underlining red in his Bible. So like those types of things, as well as listening to him tell a lot of family history and stories as well. That knowledge transmission is actually very important. Even at a young age, I would love to know, how did the stories you listened to from your grandfather, or your great-grandfather rather, how did that translate into some of the work you ended up pioneering, and even the civil rights history that you became so interested in?
I think I'm a teacher and educator, mm-hmm. and also someone who works in documentary history, mm-hmm. and oral history, because that's the world in which I lived as a young kid. I'm originally from Augusta, Georgia, about an hour from Columbia.
Yeah.
And my great-grandparents lived in Aiken across the Savannah River. And they lived in an area that was called Petticoat Junction. That was the name given to the community. And they lived in an old white house that was once a shotgun house that was later modified, built upon by one of my uncles who served in the military. And they had a huge porch, or at least it was huge in my little imagination. Mm-hmm. And that porch became a classroom. And yes. I would sit, there would be shucking peas or pulling collards. And as they're doing that, they're talking. And I'm listening. And similarly, in Augusta, where I'm from, I lived my earliest years with my mother's parents, my grandparents. And we lived in a place called the Delta Manor Public Housing Project. And I got to know everybody along East Taylor Street. I knew the Easterlands, the Greshams, the Bates, Miss Cassie, Miss Francine, Miss Hattie Mae. These were all of my grandmother's friends. And every day, nearly all day, my grandmother would be on the phone talking to her friends. Oh. And I'm not altogether clear what they were talking about, but I was listening. Mm-hmm. Now, some would say I was nosy as a child. I would say I was precocious. I was intrigued. Yes, and I think that art of listening was very much something that I took along with me through the rest of my career. And so although I have formal training as a historian, although I got a PhD in history at Emory University, I always say that my best training as both a teacher and a scholar occurred in Petticoat Junction and in the Delta Manor Housing Project.
Yes, sir. You know, I think that when I reflect on this, it's very powerful, and it has a huge impression on a young person when they're able to have that relationship with someone that's older. And my greatest regret is not writing a lot of things that I heard down. Do you have some way of keeping what you heard, or some way of canonizing that?
Well, some of those earliest memories I've written down.
Yes, sir.
At some points, my grandmother's siblings were living. I recorded their memories.
Yes, sir.
But one important moment occurred in my life that connects to my grandfather. Mm-hmm. There's a national program now. It's called National History Day. Mm-hmm. It has been going for decades. And it's where they identify students in schools to either do research projects, to do dramatic presentations for competition. And I have always been passionate about history and social studies. And I was elected to represent the state of Georgia at National History Day, probably in, I can't remember the year, middle school or my freshman year in high school. And for my project, I decided to do a monologue. I went to an all-Black elementary school in Augusta. And then I joined an integrated public fine arts school, a magnet school. Mm-hmm. And to go into that magnet school, you have to declare a major. Oh. Now, when I was in sixth grade, I was playing the violin. And that was my declared major at the time, music. But at 6 years of sixth grade, seventh grade, playing the violin was not too cool. At least I thought at the time. And I deeply regret that I did not continue. So I had to find a new major. And so I declared drama. And so I became a theater major at Davidson Fine Arts School in Augusta. And so for National History Day, I decided to do a dramatic piece about a sharecropper who had a second grade education. Now, Granddaddy had passed not long before I made this declaration. And so he was not there to help me in preparing for the monologue. And as part of the National History Day, you have to substantiate your dramatic pieces with secondary and primary sources. And so for me, one of the items I checked out of the library to give some background about life in South Carolina in the late 1890s and early 1900s was a book. And the book was entitled Born to Rebel. And Born to Rebel was an autobiography of a man named Dr. Benjamin Elijah Mays, yes, who is from Greenwood County, South Carolina. Dr. Mays and my great-grandfather, Mo Daddy, they all were born around the same time. Wow. In similar circumstances. Granddaddy received a second grade education. Dr. Mays pursued a PhD at the University of Chicago, becomes the president of Morehouse College, becomes a mentor to Dr. King. And I was intrigued reading that book that here are two young Negroes born in South Carolina in the late 19th century who have very different outcomes. And so I really want to know more about Mays. I read the book, Born to Rebel. And I tell people now, all these decades later, that book had such a profound impact on me that I kept the book. I never returned it. It's in my office today.
Wow.
The Born to Rebel book. And in that book, Mays talks about how he led a life defying expectations, going beyond the boundaries placed before him. And so he leaves Epworth. He goes to South Carolina State for high school. And then he makes a bold decision. In the early 19th century, early 20th century, Benjamin Elijah Mays of Greenwood County, South Carolina, decides to go to college. And he decides to go to a all-white liberal arts college in Maine called Bates College. Who does that? And so ironically, years later, when I leave my performing arts high school in Augusta, and it's time for me to make a decision about college, I go to a largely white liberal arts college in Connecticut called Wesley University. And I think that thought of even going to a school like that was very much shaped by my own reading and understanding of someone like Benjamin Mays,
Yes,
who again was a contemporary of Mo Daddy, Smart Williams.
Wow. It's powerful how, you shared about your great-grandfather being named, first of all, Smart Williams.
Jr. Smart Williams Jr.
Smart Williams Jr. So there's a Smart Williams even before him. And he ends up, even though despite him only having a second grade education, not being able to write, he raises up a great grandson who enters to places that he never did or would have, or maybe only read about.
Now, in talking about granddaddy, I should be careful because I shall hear about this from my mother and my aunt and uncles. My great-grandfather's, one of his greatest gifts and contributions was shaping and molding my grandmother.
Yes.
My grandmother, Ruby, who was his second oldest child, his daughter. My grandmother, Ruby, was the person with whom I lived in the Delta Mountain Housing Project. She and my grandfather, Charlie Briscoe.
Yes, sir.
And Mama, that's what I called her. She was brilliant. She was head of her class at Schofield High School in Aiken. If circumstances had been different, she would have gone on to college, but that was not her path. And I learned later from talking to people who were her contemporaries that she was extremely gifted and smart. And she was hard on me as a little kid because I think she recognized that being average was unacceptable.
Yes, sir.
And so she pushed in that house in Augusta, Georgia. She was the one who really pushed me to excel in school. She really cultivated my interest in reading. She was always on me about my homework. And so I was an exceptional student because I had an exceptional grandmother who was shaped by Smart Williams. And so she very much was a tremendous influence on me. She died when I was in the sixth grade. So she never saw what became, but her legacy is indeed reflecting what I do to this very day.
Yes, sir. One thing that stood out when you talked about being interested or having interest in drama or theater was the fact that critical to historical knowledge is also, I think, theater and arts and those types of things are very much needed, especially in the lives of minority children. I'm thinking about the Ernest A. Finney Jr. Cultural Arts Center that's arriving in Columbia, the need for art in urban space, performing arts as well in urban spaces in downtown Columbia. It helps along with historical knowledge such as SC63, which we're going to get to talk about.
Sure.
They sort of work together. You cannot, divorce art or performing arts from the historical context of the times in which they're produced as well. Another thing.
Well, let me just say my own interest in theater.
Yes, sir.
I just come from a dramatic family. They had no formal training. We were just theatrical people. And so I carried that and then did formal training in that. And I mentioned the front porch. I mean, when I think about my own family's life, it's like a scene either from Color Purple or some Zora Neale Hurston novel. I mean, It was not fiction, it was real. And so I've always had this sort of keen interest in the stories and the voices and the perspective of ordinary people who are very much a mirror of my own family. One other important person who shaped me before I went to the Performing Arts School was a woman named Mrs. C.W. Eason. And Miss Eason was the librarian at W.S. Hornsby Elementary. And I mention Hornsby Elementary because I was born in 1971. And when I went to kindergarten in 76, it was largely an all-Black school. Now, this is decades now after the ruling of Brown versus the Board of Education. So although I'm born during the era of desegregation, my earliest schooling was in a Black school. Now, we had a few white teachers. I remember a handful of white students, but by and large, Hornsby was a Black school. Miss Eason took an interest in me and many others at Hornsby. Miss Eason was librarian, but she was more than that. She was like guidance counselor, career planner. And Miss Eason was the advisor to this group called the Library Club. And the Library Club was a very influential organization in our school, at least I thought it was. And I became the president of it. And one of the things that Miss Eason did, we would help her shelve books, organize the magazines, but we also would do bulletin boards. And we would cut out columns from Jet magazine, from Ebony magazine, from a local Black newspaper, and we would put them on the bulletin boards all year, not just February. And it was Miss Eason who really opened my own eyes to Black history, to publications like Jet and Ebony. And she also exposed us beyond the school. We went on field trips. We met the first Black mayor of Augusta. We went to his office. And then on one occasion, we went to a school called Payne College. And Payne is a historically Black college in Augusta. It's a school where my father also attended. And one year, Payne was celebrating its centennial anniversary. And the speaker was someone I didn't know, but he was an amazing orator, had a commanding presence. He was a professor. And in 5th grade, I did not know what that term meant. He was a professor from the University of Chicago. His name was Dr. John Hope Franklin. And Dr. Franklin wrote one of the leading African-American history textbooks called From Slavery to Freedom. So here I am, a 5th grader with Miss Eason, watching this figure in the pulpit who sounded like a preacher, but who was a professor. And now this is before I read Born to Rebel. I'm pretty certain it was. And so this idea of a professor holding forth as he did was also ingrained in my mind. But that exposure was because Miss Eason was a woman who said, yes, some of you are born in housing projects. That's your beginning. That's not your ending. And I believe that sincerely. She preached that into us, and I decided, you know what? I will be your disciple to prove that to be true.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned Black history, and it sparks something in my mind because you are leading an amazing project right here in South Carolina with regard to civil rights history, even more broadly. You mentioned that Cecil Williams, who we've had on the show before, at his documentary screening, that if Mr. Cecil had not taken pictures mm-hmm. of what was going on in South Carolina, many people would not know about the civil rights history in South Carolina and even in Columbia. Right. Talk about the initiative of that project, because you are the leading scholar of SC 63, Columbia SC 63. Sure. Talk about the endeavor, what it seeks to do, and maybe give us a quick profile of some of the stories that you've been able to talk about.
I joined the faculty of the University of South Carolina in the fall of 1999. Mm-hmm. And I came here with every intention of staying 1 year. Mm-hmm. I was going to come, keep my bags packed, and keep moving. Yes. And here we are now, all these years later, mm-hmm. and the rest is history. And it's history in part because when I came to the University of South Carolina, I joined two other scholars in both history and African American studies. And that 1 year kept moving further down the line,
Mm-hmm.
in part because of the amazing students that I had the good fortune of teaching and learning from, but also the number of projects that began to emerge, public history projects. And so we had worked on documenting the history of Black neighborhoods
Mm-hmm.
in downtown Columbia that have been displaced. We had worked on the history of the Booker T. Washington High School
Mm-hmm.
in Columbia.
Yeah.
And we started doing other type projects. And then in 2012 or 2013, Steve Benjamin, the first African-American mayor of Columbia, approached me about a project that he wanted to do in collaboration with the mayors of some other southern cities. And they wanted to look at the history of milestone civil rights events in their respective cities. And those cities included Selma, Montgomery, and Birmingham, Alabama, Memphis, Tennessee, Jackson, Mississippi, and Washington, D.C.
Mm-hmm.
So let me go down the list again. Selma, Montgomery,
Yes.
Birmingham,
Mm-hmm.
Jackson, Memphis. Many people, some people, can tell you about significant civil rights events in those respective cities. Then you have Columbia. What's going on in Columbia? And when Mayor Benjamin approached us, it was a big question mark.
Yeah.
What took place in this city that was comparable or in line with the things we had learned about in Eyes on the Prize or things we had been taught about in schools? So we began an in-depth project to look through newspapers, to look through archival collections, to look at moving image material, and to look at photographs.
Yeah.
And during that course of that project, we developed a new initiative called Columbia SC 63: Our Story Matters. That project was to be a 1-year project that is still now in its 10th year. The project has led to a number of exhibits, a website, a walking tour, wayside signs down Main Street, and it continues with a number of other programming. There's now at the Columbia Museum of Art a new exhibit called Intersections, and that exhibit looks at the history of the African American presence in downtown Columbia, South Carolina. One of the key contributions, I believe, of that project is that it illuminated largely overlooked or largely unknown stories about the civil rights movement in Columbia and in South Carolina. And so a visitor down Main Street can now see photographs of students who were demonstrating along Main Street or who were protesting at the State House. And they can learn more about their memories and their experiences. At the corner of Washington and Main today, there's a photograph of a young woman named Sarah Mae Fleming, who many people were not fully aware of her story 10 years ago. And hopefully now they know that Sarah Mae Fleming was a phenomenal young woman who in 1954 dared to believe that change was possible. She sits down on a city bus on June 22nd of 1954. Now that date is significant. It's 1 month after the landmark Brown v. Board of Education Supreme Court case. And it's 17 months before Rosa Parks sits down in Montgomery, Alabama. The story of Sarah Mae Fleming is now one more widely understood, I think, because of the work of Columbia 63 and other projects. One of the most amazing relationships that emerged out of Columbia 63 was a relationship with a young man out of Orangeburg, South Carolina, named Cecil Williams. So imagine you have the photographs of the movement and you still have opportunities to talk to the photographer who was taking images 60 years ago. And so he's been an extraordinary mentor, teacher, and colleague, and has in his own right created an extraordinary museum in Orangeburg in a home he designed. And so that's been a great partnership of Columbia 63.
And we love Mr. Cecil and all of the great work, and they're continuing to expand that Civil Rights Project as well, and the museum down in Orangeburg, South Carolina. Now, I do want to ask this because this great knowledge, about civil rights history, especially in South Carolina, I've been learning a lot more about that myself, from Briggs v. Elliott to Edwardsville, South Carolina, is quite legendary and also groundbreaking in terms of integration, bus integration, school integration, all of that. But if our generation doesn't, and I say that because I'm 23, if we're not knowledgeable about it or are able to carry it on or be holders of it, the next generation will be lost and we'll have to do some other groundbreaking project like SC63 to keep it going. Has there been some stories where you've seen it successfully transmit to younger people and they're doing something with it?
Oh, all the time.
Okay.
So when I say we, it's Bobby Donaldson and undergraduates, or Bobby Donaldson and graduate students, or Bobby Donaldson and community members. There's been whatever success people credit to me.
Yes, sir.
Is a direct result of these collaborations and the tremendous investment of time and energy of the students with whom I work. One of the ladies in Columbia 63 who had a phenomenal impact on me, there's a photograph on the corner of Main and Washington, the very same corner where you find a picture of Sarah Mae Fleming. There's a photograph of African-American men and women standing in line to vote in the summer of 1948. And the very first person in that line is a woman with a white dress holding up an umbrella, has on glasses, her head is down. That photograph was sitting in our archives for decades until someone finally said, "That's Miss Wilson." And I said, "Well, who was Miss Wilson?" They said Miss Wilson was a teacher, civil rights activist. And I kept talking about Miss Wilson in the past tense. They're like, "Well, she's still living." And so I go visit Miss Donella Brown Wilson when she was about 99 years old. And she lived to be 108 years old. And so I would spend time with her regularly. And when I met Miss Wilson had a very difficult time hearing, and she was blind. And so imagine trying to talk to someone who had a hearing impairment and she could not see you. And so one time I went to visit Miss Wilson, and we had talked for a lengthy period of time, and she leaned into her daughter, whose name was Patricia, and said, "Patricia, that's Dr. Donaldson?" She said, "Yeah, Mama, that's Dr. Donaldson." She said, "Is he colored? Is he colored?" And I guess she thought I couldn't hear her.
Uh-huh.
So Patricia said, "Yes, Mama, he's one of us." And Ms. Wilson said, "Good." She said good, and later she explained that her own mother was a domestic housekeeper on the campus of the University of South Carolina in the 1920s. And she explained that during that time period, and even the decades thereafter, the only Black people who were even permitted to be on the campus were those who wore a uniform, either a uniform to clean buildings, to cook in the cafeterias, or to do the landscaping. And she said she never even envisioned there might be a moment where there would be a colored professor at the university, yet alone one coming to her house to speak about it. And once she realized what we were doing with all of this history, she said something that connects to your question. She said, you're recording me and you're putting these things in the archives. She said, but history has no purpose unless you use it. And that is what we've been doing with Columbia 63. And that is actually the mantra of another organization I lead called the Center for Civil Rights History and Research. And with these photographs, moving images, letters, we're trying to employ those materials to educate the public, to advance the research and teaching of African American history and civil rights, but also to do programming. And by programming, I mean we do training for teachers. We go into schools and present this material in many exhibits. We've done a series of lectures around the state of South Carolina. And we also now have a traveling exhibit called Justice for All that is just concluded in Georgetown County, South Carolina. That exhibit has traveled from Columbia to Sumter, to Orangeburg, to Hartsville, to Spartanburg, to Beaufort, and now to Georgetown. And in each of those spaces, we provide a traveling trunk of material designed for young people, because we're of the mind that this material has no utility or function unless it can be absorbed and carried on by young people. And I have to say that one of my greatest joys is to see this history embraced by young audiences who carry it forward.
Well, as a native of Marion, South Carolina, I'm going to suggest that the Just for All needs to come to the PD as well.
In the
yes.
Justice for All exhibit, there is, you mentioned Edwards versus South Carolina.
Yes, sir.
There is a photograph that we have. It is a photograph taken days after a protest in downtown Columbia at the State House, where over 188 students are arrested for marching around the grounds of the State House. That arrest leads to a landmark Supreme Court case called Edwards versus South Carolina. Among those arrested was a man named the Reverend I. D. Quincy Newman, who later becomes a South Carolina state senator. Among those arrested was a man named Dr. B.J. Glover, who was the pastor of Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. Among those arrested was a woman named Leola Clement, who later becomes a member of the General Assembly from Greenville, and a young man named James E. Clyburn was arrested. Days afterward, there was a press conference at Zion, and those in the photograph are Reverend Newman, Benjamin Glover, a woman named Ruby Hurley, and a preacher who was from Marion, South Carolina.
No way.
He was a graduate of Mars College.
Okay.
And after finishing Mars, he goes to Greenville, and he becomes the pastor of a church in Greenville called Springfield Baptist. And while pastor of Springfield Baptist, he has a direct influence on a young man named the Reverend Jesse Jackson. This man is named James S. Hall Jr. And James S. Hall Jr. then leaves Greenville and becomes the pastor of the Triumph Baptist Church in Philadelphia. He's still preaching at 91 years old. And not too long ago, he called me to connect to something you asked. He was very concerned, or is very concerned, about what he perceives as the assault on Black history and the assault on civil rights history and the shrinking of a history that all of us have worked to expand. So Reverend Hall called to ask if I could provide some guidance to his church. He said, we're going to always battle what's happening in places like Florida. But while we're battling in those spaces, we need to own this history in our own right. And I said, what do you mean by that, Reverend Hall? He said, we can't just expect the teachers to teach history. We should be teaching it ourselves. And the churches need to play a critical role. And we want to develop our own curriculum. In fact, he said, we're going to turn Sunday school into Black history classes. So this preacher from Marion, your hometown, is doing that just now at 91 years old.
Oh, wow. And I think that really gets to the question I was going to ask you, which is about integrity, and particularly civil rights history integrity. I think sometimes, you already mentioned certain states, but especially across the nation, there's sort of an assault on historical integrity. And, it's sort of being made into this is your perspective of history, this is my lens, this is your perspective, and not actually ascertaining truth or getting at truth. What do you feel is your responsibility as a professor, as an academic, as a historian, in preserving historical integrity? How do we, even as the public, get at that ourselves?
During one of our exhibits, we had a photograph of students in stride walking down Main Street in March of 1960. And the photograph was on display at a storefront in Columbia. And when it was on display, a gentleman comes by and he said, what movie is this picture from? And I said, sir, that's not an image from a movie, that's from Columbia, March of 1960. He said, no, he said, you're wrong. That can't be Columbia. I said, what do you mean it can't be Columbia? He said, there was nothing like that here. There was no movement like that in Columbia. And I said, well, let me show you some other photographs. These are images from our collection. To answer your question, my job is to provide the evidence. and to keep digging for evidence. 40 years ago, a lot of this material was not accessible. It was not readily available. And part of my work is to make sure that the sources are as comprehensive and as diverse as they can be. And so what are we doing now? We're constantly seeking new materials. We are archiving those materials. We are digitizing those materials, and we are making the public aware of those materials so that you have before you what? The facts. You have before you the sources. And then you can then make the judgment call. And part of what is so concerning to me now is that there are those who are willing to just ignore the obvious facts that are now more readily available. And so my job is to do my work as a historian, to uncover material, to document that material, and then perhaps more importantly, to teach young men and women how to make their own judgments, how to be critical readers, how to be effective writers and communicators so that they can carry this work on.
Now, someone could be watching this and be at home and they may have some old photographs that provide further evidence. Mm-hmm. How can they contribute that sort of to SC63 or to the center?
Well, it's a constant work in progress, and that's what makes my job exciting. Mm-hmm. Nearly every day, there is a discovery. Every day, there's a photograph which was unknown. All of a sudden, we now have a story that goes with it. On Columbia SC63's website, there is actually a platform where you can go in and either share your story or you can review unknown images and provide some identifications for them. At the same time, I always encourage people, when people pass away, don't rush to get rid of things. Spend some time thinking through what might be valuable historically. I can't tell you how many times we hear stories of families not really knowing the significance of an item, and it's put on the curb. On that curb is a piece of history. So part of what we're eager to do is work with families, churches, and organizations to come in to provide some consultation about what should be preserved and even where it should be preserved. Of course, we would love to have things at our university, but there are great repositories around this state which are about the business of preserving and documenting this history.
Yes, sir. Now, I do want to go back to sort of wrap up this conversation. You know, you talked about a fork in the road you came to when you sort of were deciding to go to Wesleyan or Morehouse. Now, you wanted to go to law school and do all these things and make sense of the theater and history passions, you know, and your life might look a lot different. Do you ever think about what that other path might have been?
So Morehouse is interesting. So Benjamin Mays, president of Morehouse.
Yeah.
Morehouse was actually founded in Augusta, Georgia, in a church connected with my family. And growing up, and I didn't say this at the outset, so there was a lot of people in my family and in my family churches who just knew that Bobby Flipper would be a preacher. And if you're going to be a Black Baptist preacher, you just go to Morehouse. That Morehouse groomed preachers. And that's why I got as far away as I could and went to Connecticut. Because that was not, if I were going to preach, I wanted to preach in the classroom.
Yes, sir.
And so I bring that gift now. I can't help it.
Yeah.
That's what I do. And so I tell people my pulpit is the classroom.
That's right.
And ironically, now think about this. I leave Augusta, Georgia, and I go to Middletown, Connecticut, to a predominantly white school.
Yeah.
At that school, I'm shaped by some extraordinary Black professors who actually encouraged me. That said, you've come here declaring you want to be an attorney, which is what I did. If you look at all the records, that's what I said I wanted to do. Have you ever thought about being an academic? And I'm like, what is that? What is an academic? And there's this one professor named Michael Harris who saw my interest in history. And he said, well, there is this special program called the Mellon Minority Fellowship. And I'm like, what is that? He said, the Mellon Minority Fellowship is designed to identify students from quote unquote underrepresented backgrounds who might pursue careers in the academy. So we had to unpack all that. What underrepresented means what? The academy is what? Professor Harris explained all that to me, and then he said this. He said it pays far more money than you're getting paid right now as a work study student. And as a young work study student, my job was to shelve books in our library. And I said, well, I'll get paid more money to do what? He said research, write books, go to conferences. I said, I'll take it. And that program really became a training ground for me to pursue my PhD and to do what I'm doing now. Now, the irony about all that is I go all the way to Connecticut to be trained by Black professors and some great white professors, but also I majored in African-American studies. I was an African-American studies and history major at a predominantly white school. Some of my closest friends are from that school. I learned radio while at Wesleyan. I was a gospel DJ announcer every Sunday morning at WESU 88.1 FM. I got to know a lot of African Americans who were in the Hartford and Middletown area who all ironically were from South Carolina. So it had a tremendous influence on me. And the other irony of this is I'm writing a book now about William Jefferson White, who was the founder of Morehouse College.
Oh, wow. Do you still remember your opening line on the radio?
I do not.
You do not?
I do not.
Okay. Well,
the radio show actually was one that I co-hosted and picked up from a gentleman named Marshall Montz. Mm-hmm. It was called The Gospel Express. And he's still doing it to this very day, all these years later. Oh, man. And I left college 30 years ago. And so he's still about that important business.
We are glad that you responded to your real calling, which was, to serve the students at USC, the civil rights canon that needs to be built, and of course, the public of South Carolina. That's still your ministry. So we're grateful that you chose that. And I was going to ask you what you were going to do next, or what's next for you at the center of the project. You talked about a book. Is there anything else that we should be knowledgeable about? Sure.
We're continuing our Justice for All exhibit. We are working to expand a new exhibit at the Columbia Museum of Art. It's called Intersections. So that project continues. I'm doing research now on a man named Joseph Rainey, who was the first African-American elected to Congress in 1870, who is from Georgetown, South Carolina. So that's a project I'm working on as well. Much of my days now are in administration and fundraising and development. So I'm trying to carve out time now to continue doing research and hopefully get back to teaching as well.
Absolutely. I'm sure that the students will love that. And now you also, this is what we'll end on. You were very vital as well in doing some leadership development at the University of South Carolina during your time there. What's the importance, I guess, of raising up students to be leaders?
So in addition to being an administrator, leading the center, and being a professor in history and African American studies, for 6 years, I was the faculty principal of a place called Preston Residential College. It's in the heart of our campus. And I had the audacity to actually not only want to teach students, but live with them. Yeah. And so for 5 of those 6 years, my wife and our 2 kids lived with over 200 undergraduates. And that was an eye-opening and one of the most exciting moments of my career. And our charge at that time was to take these young people and to provide programming, instruction, and mentorship to develop leaders. And so Preston became a leadership incubator on campus and continues to do so to this day. And though I spent those 5-6 years with Preston, I continue to have those important relationships. And part of what I enjoy about being a professor was very much shaped by my experience at Preston, because yes, I'm an endowed professor. Yes, I'm an executive director, but I'm every day a student. I'm always learning. And to having had that experience of living with these young people, it really shaped my own thinking about higher education, and it changed the way I taught. Living with students, you have a whole different perspective about motivations, study habits, and I learned that the weekend starts on Wednesday. for students in many ways. And as much as I want students to kind of be focused in my classes, I've become aware that my class was just one piece of their undergraduate experience. And that experience at Preston really gave me a deeper awareness and appreciation of the undergraduate experience on our campus.
Yes, sir. A leader never stops being a learner. That's what I hear from you. And that's what sort of gives you that cutting edge and why you're still relevant and why the civil rights work that you're doing now is still relevant. So thank you so much.
Well, thank
Dr.
you for the
Donaldson.
opportunity.
Of course. Thank you for being here. All right, y'all. It's the Culture Connect. We'll see you next time. Did you enjoy the episode? I hope you did. Be sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel and connect with us on all digital platforms so you don't miss the next episode of the Culture Connect. We'll see you next time, everybody.